welcome everybody. This is the 7th talk of our Open for Discussion series. The first one actually live. The previous ones were all on Zoom, so we're very happy to be live actually, because I think a discussion or a debate works a little bit better in a physical sense than digital. My name is Jorn Konijn. I am doctoral research operating within the Curatorial Research Collective here at TUE. And in this series, we attempt to critically engage with the persistent problem architecture has with diversity and representation. Over the past several weeks, and with a very diverse group of guest speakers, we have explored how problems with diversity and representation have manifested, and in certain cases, how they dealt with the context of architectural education and within the architectural profession. Today, we'll be exploring the subject of identity and the neutral framework. We will focus on the ways in which the cultural backgrounds of dwellers are translated within the built environment, specifically addressing the neighborhood of Amsterdam Zuid-Oost, better known as the Bijlmer. And I think we have a first slide. The Bijlmer was created from an ultimate kind of modernist idea, that of an empty canvas with a radical top-down design. Housing for the middle class, specifically for those with a pioneering spirit. The design of the dwellings embodied the idea of a neutral canvas, exactly the same canvas for everybody. A white box which everybody could use as a background to expand. Maybe some people disagree with that, but as a background to expand upon according to their own wishes and ideas. The architect provided the framework, the dweller, the identity, the infill. This radical idea is best illustrated with an anecdote about the mastermind behind the Bijlmer, Siegfried Nassuth. I think that's the next slide. Nassuth had suffered a sincere trauma from his experiences as a war prisoner, and he was convinced that society and architecture as its manifestation should be as equal as possible. No hierarchy or social differences should be expressed in the architecture of the Bijlmer. When the young architect Piet de Bruijn started working as an intern under Nassuth, working on the Bijlmer, he drew a design for windows in a blank wall. I think that's the next slide. So Piet de Bruijn imagined some windows on this side here. Meaning the dwellers living on the far end side would have one window more than the dwellers living in the middle. When Nassuth heard about it, he gave a very angry speech, because this was the worst thing that someone could do. Why did that one house, that one person, have to get that special condition? Was the dweller better than the others? The window then disappeared. So from this very kind of radical idea, the Bijlmer was created. This radical approach typifies the Bijlmer, but over the course of the last 4 or 5 decades, the Bijlmer has evolved into something different. With a huge influx of very diverse groups of dwellers, the Bijlmer has radically changed, or maybe not. How do architects today deal with this legacy of Nassuth, deal with the question of identity? We'll be talking to 2 architects today, both with plenty of experience working in the Bijlmer. Jeroen Geurst, founding partner of Geurst and Schulze Architecten. And today we will be specifically talking about the Miosso building that your office designed in the Bijlmer. Thank you very much for joining. And Wouter Pocornie, architect and urbanist born and raised in the Bijlmer. You are partner at the Black Archives Bijlmer and part of the Prospect 11, which is a creative hub in the Bijlmer as well. Thank you both for joining.
Thank you.
I would like to start. I think maybe Wouter, you wanted very quickly to say something.
I want to I want to give my sincere apologies for being late. Honestly, this was not intentional, and it was not even. I can't blame it on the traffic or anything. It was just a miscalculation in my schedule. So
I think better late than never, right?
Yeah, hopefully. let me try to prove that tonight, this afternoon.
Thank you so much. I've asked Jeroen maybe to first talk a little bit about the Miosso project, and I think you also have some slides about the project.
Yes, I brought some slides of.
And very quickly to interrupt, sorry, I have to say that people who are watching from YouTube can ask questions by typing in somewhere. I hope that's clear, sorry, and then I'll get the question and pass it on to the speakers. Sorry, Jeroen, go ahead.
Actually, I brought slides on 3 projects, but mainly I think the Miosso project is interesting for this discussion. Maybe this first slide can be presented. This project started in 2008, so it was finished last year, so it lasted 13 years almost. Due to the crisis, it was not because of the quality of the project itself, but due to the crisis. It was in 2008. At that moment, there was a huge economic crisis, and there was no market for projects in the Netherlands at all. So, but finally, we managed to realize this project. Our client was a developer, Era Contour, and later housing association Eigenhaard. So it's part of the project are houses for sale, and the other part is social housing. And it is in a part of the Bijlmer where was low-rise housing programmed, and also some schools were there, and there was a leftover space. So it was not a part where these huge gallery buildings were destroyed, but it was a free space. And when I started to work, maybe two interesting things. Just before I finished my project Le Midi in Rotterdam with the same client, which was based on the urbanism of Rotterdam, but also on architecture of the Mediterranean, because a lot of new people in Rotterdam had their origins in North Africa and Southern Europe. So it was an idea of a Moroccan entrepreneur who wanted to do something with his cultural background. And there was a group of architects who studied what to do with this background, and they've developed a kind of toolkit, they called it. And later on, I was the urbanist and later the architect, and I used this toolkit to do the project Le Midi, which had a lot of publicity and is still well known, I think. It's still a special project also in my own practice. And so we finished this project, and then the same developer, Era Contour, was invited in a competition in Amsterdam, and they asked me if I would join them, and then my first impression was, no, we can't do a second Le Midi in this part of Amsterdam because these people have a very different background. And
the program was already defined? It was supposed to be housing? Or?
Yes, it was housing, partly social and partly commercial housing.
With specific groups in mind? Could you tell about that?
Yes, we wanted to build for people who otherwise would go to Almere to buy their first houses, mainly what we call starters on the market. So cheap, relatively cheap houses for sale. That's one part, and the other was social housing. And but I can explain it later. But so there was one point was the background of the Le Midi way of working, and the other one was that my wife, she has a Suriname background, and my mother-in-law, she lived for a long time in the building next to the site. So in with this strange form, there is
the plot is here in the middle, I think, huh?
The plot is on the right, with right side with the red roofs, and on the left side there is a kind of cross-form building, and there lived my mother-in-law. She returned already, when I started, she had already returned to Suriname, but I used to sit there on her balcony, and I knew that location very well. So I said, it's a project with a North African background is quite strange in Bijlmer, so maybe we can do something with the Suriname tradition of building, of living. And then we started to make some sketches. Maybe we can, the next slide, please. So I made some sketches of higher buildings for the social housing, for the cheaper houses, and large villas, large houses, white wooden houses in a green atmosphere. So, and I started also study some typologies from Suriname. So wooden houses are traditional there, and houses on pilotis, so lifted up from the ground and the car underneath. And this idea we presented to the city, and my client won the competition and was invited to develop the project. But then the crisis began, and we had to wait for a long time, maybe 7, 8 years, until the client started up this project. And then he said that the type of housing we used was interesting, but commercially not suitable and also too expensive. Next slide, please. So this was were the first impressions we had. So houses lifted up, or big villas with 4 smaller houses in it. A set of green urban public spaces with trees in it, crossing the area. So a space which really connects the different plots of the houses. And there were still some plots which were already built by, there was already a school, 2 schools and a gymnasium. So we had, it was a very diverse situation. Next slide. So the idea was to use verandas to extend the houses with an extra space, an outdoor space, lifted up from a more communal area or public space.
And quite a contrast with the traditional idea of the Bijlmer, the high-rises and the modernist flats.
We were not interested in that, because we thought, can we do something else there? And later on, we tried to adapt it more to the urban structure, but also these long apartment buildings are not next to the site; they are further away from the plot. And in this area, there was already an urban reconstruction of more traditional urban structures with streets, and so next to the plot is a new project of Dick van Gameren and L Architects. They made just traditional apartment buildings along the Karspeldreef, which is the name of the street. And maybe we go. So later on, the developer proposed a standard Dutch house. He said, I can build this for a very low price. And then I started to make a new urban scheme with this standard Dutch house, and I transformed it with a set of more Suriname-based, which is in fact it's the influence of the colonial style in Suriname. There is in Suriname it's not a real Suriname architecture, but it's also a mix of different influences from the Netherlands, from the United States, from Germany. But I like very much this mix, and I try to use elements like verandas and shutters and all these elements which make these houses more livable for the people, and also it was for a very low price because I used the Dutch standards. And the same I did with the apartment building, which is on top, where I detailed the traditional galleries as the kind of verandas, and the balconies the same. And what is very typical for Suriname is the white color with the green doors. And the next slide, please. So this is the apartment building, just for Eigen Haard, the housing association. And there's also a kind of veranda on the ground floor with the brick plinth, the red brick plinth, and the cantilevering roof on top. So not a flat roof like all the buildings have in the Bijlmer, but pitched roof. Next. And here's the outdoor space in front of the social housing. To the right is the outdoor space around the one-family houses. And in between the houses there are no streets, but there is a kind of park system with wadis. These are ditches for when there is a lot of rain. And now was rightly after the completion. Now it's completely green. Next. And there is a communal garden in between the houses, which is for the inhabitants who live around this garden. And we planted it with flowers which reminds of the Suriname flowers. And now the garden is in use by the people who live there around. And there is a very interesting mix of people with Suriname background, but also a Dutch background or mixed couples, or and I come there quite often to see how it works. And I think it's a very I think there will be a very strong community in the future. I hope so.
When was it finished? When was
last year.
Last year. Okay.
Yeah.
Nice.
This is the last slide. Or maybe this is the. And I made a study of the doors, so I made different patterns on the doors, which I studied in Paramaribo. I did a study of all the front doors in Paramaribo, and I used it, and people could choose a different pattern on their own door. Next, so then this the MIDI. So then. Yeah.
Perhaps thank you for now. I would say maybe Wouter. Perhaps you could tell a little bit about your practice. And growing up in Bijlmer and your thoughts about the architecture there.
Yeah, thank you. Well, first, growing up in the Bijlmer, I guess. I grew up in Geurst and design from Sticht. So pretty well known as a modernist Dutch architect. And I also, if I teach, for example, especially in the Bijlmer, even in the high schools, I often use that architectural example to tell a story about what I think is interesting about one of the projects in the Bijlmer, because he was inspired by the Mali and the Dogon culture. And in the end, a lot of these are raw materials, often referred to as gray and green at the Bijlmer, licht, lucht en ruimte, spacious designs. And the more you delve into those stories, it's very interesting to find out what happened in this very young borough of Amsterdam. You consider it 50 plus, 50, 52, I guess now, 51, 52 years old. But some of these post-65 architectural styles are now being considered as monuments. And I grew up in Groenhoven. Gouden Leeuw and Groenhoven are those tower blocks, which basically have the ontsluiting, like the way it's been organized is that you enter the building from within. So instead of the typical Bijlmer design where you drive one level up on the Dreef, on the car road, then in the parking garage, then in the sky bridge, and then in the building. Here, the sky bridge goes down, and you actually have a luscious organization on the ground level, and then you enter the building from within. Well, I tell these stories even to the young kids because I want to show them how far you can take a concept and bring actually a new formed identity in the building itself, because it's based on the mothership symbol of the Dogon culture. So I always kind of knew that the Bijlmer was something else, because I consider myself a Bijlmer native, and that's a term that I use very much inspired by how I hear US citizens or urban people from the cities like New York talk. And I think that it gave my generation, I'm 35 now, almost 35, they gave a different type of reference. We grew up in these blocks, we grew up in these streets, and we've seen the Bijlmer transform quite rapidly, and we have always faced stigmatization by being part of this, what they will often refer to as a Dutch ghetto. And then I went to the Delft University and I studied architecture and I also studied urbanism. And I just kept on seeing the Bijlmer being like an part of the Dutch canon. Like it's a begrip, I don't know, it's a term, it's a reference. And I saw a lot of the students read one paragraph and then repeat the information. So I was like, okay. At first I wasn't telling people I was from the Bijlmer, but every time somebody knew, especially the teachers, they were like, oh, I needed to be ready. So I understood that this was something special, and I went to school in Amsterdam, the south part of Amsterdam, which is very different. So I started to really integrate into perceptions of the Bijlmer while figuring out my own perspective on the perception and both on the Bijlmer as well. So fast forward, I worked at the architectural firm in Dordrecht, very functional healthcare design for 3 years as a research and development and architect. And then I also did some jobs as an urbanist in different offices. Then I worked for the Amsterdam municipality or the city of Amsterdam as an urban designer on mostly Project Sluisbuurt, and later on also a little bit on the southeast. And then I realized, and I was invited to work on certain assignments, particularly one in the K neighborhood of the Bijlmer, which is where me also is located. I grew up in a G neighborhood, so it's 1103, 1104 are the zip codes. And both the activist groups or the action groups, it's not really activists in that sense, as the municipal project team of the city, we're talking about when are you going to join us again? Because we kind of need your perspective. And it was very difficult to arrange it as an ambtenaar, as a government official. And I said to the highest up, I said, I think I would be more effective if I move around as a freelancer. Because I'm organizing talks, I'm helping the municipality become more social in their approach. I really studied identity and bottom-up strategies in Delft. And I just see I'm not going to be able to do this as a government official. It's just too many steps to take. And the people that we're inviting, I know them personally. One of these people worked on a talent development program, was looking for a new space, and then we teamed up, and then we worked on this co-workspace, creative hub, Prospect 11.
Your role is then more a connector between the various groups, or what's your specific role in that?
If I describe it, it's usually in Dutch, but it's then the 4 O's. So, but translated, I do most of my projects as a researcher. I work in design teams, so I would say ontwerper, a designer as well, but far less than the research. And then the community building aspect, I kind of subdivide in entrepreneurial projects or initiatives and organization. So that really means also how difficult and sometimes how quick you can organize a group. So instead of organizing a participatory approach, I try to have a structural way of interacting with communities through the Black Archives Bijlmer, through movie nights, book clubs, you name it. And then around that, organizing dialogue about subject matters, which I then also connect with my research. And I give it, I make it transparent that I'm doing this. And just from having shared interest, this goes quite well and goes beyond what I was able to do before really joining the movement I call Prospect 11.
And is that specifically crucial of working in the Bijlmer, that you have to do this, or what's your take on that?
I think so. There's just the political situation, the short history, the blind spots. For example, also what we hear is the Bijlmer is very much dominated by Surinamese narratives. And even within that, you have multi-ethnic perspectives, but you also have a very generational hierarchy. So again, I really focus on a little bit older than me and then younger, which I call Bijlmer natives, so people that grew up and have that reference of the Bijlmer, instead of their parents. Their parents are very interesting, and I try to talk to multiple generations, especially for the archives, but they have a reference outside of the Bijlmer. And they often project something from what they are used to a whole generation, which sometimes they don't even recognize or are in contact with. So if you go to the Bijlmer, If you look at the data, yes, the majority of the group is still Surinamese, probably about 40%. But then you have the non-Western, which they now kind of changed the terms, but it's a large Ghanaian population and also a lot of other Western African populations. Then you have the, let's say, white Dutch people, which are also somewhat from the beginning as well, often Bijlmer pioneers. And then you have a lot of other mixtures and Caribbean ethnic people. And it's often, even in politics, overlooked. So a very mono-ethnic and a very dominant generational perspective on the Bijlmer is kind of like disregarding a lot of things that are very, very, very local.
How did you deal with that, Jeroen? Because you mentioned that your mother-in-law lives there, so you probably knew the Bijlmer then a little bit, but maybe also knew the Bijlmer because of these stories that I think a lot of us know. How did you start working when you started working on me also, in relation to the specific groups that Wouter is mentioning?
We invited a group of local people to discuss with us the first proposals, and then we developed the project further on. But the problem then was that because of the crisis, we had to stop the project for a couple of years, and then we transformed it to make it more appropriate for the difficult market. And then we had a new concept, and then we tried to sell this project, and all the people who were interested in it, we again formed a group with them and discussed with them how to develop the project further and what alternatives they want to choose and what.
And the specific form that you choose, is that also a way to attract specific dwellers, or how do you come about with the specific form, and then in relation to your studies that you did from Suriname? Because you mentioned there's many different types of people living there.
Yes, I think it's a fusion of Dutch elements, of course, which is the Bijlmer itself as well. So it's a Dutch payable standard house, which I transformed a little bit. So I think the special elements like the verandas and the architecture, which are the things which attracted a lot of people, and the space in between the houses. So the communal garden, the transition spaces, which makes it on the market a special project between all the other projects which are built in Amsterdam. And what is interesting that are people with a Suriname background are there, but there are also people who lived in Amsterdam Zuid, which is quite a rich area, who were interested to live here because it is a more mixed area. So they put their children on the local school next door, where their children can play freely around the house, can have their way to the school, which is not possible in other parts of Amsterdam. So it attracted people with a Suriname background and with other backgrounds. Also, and in the social housing, people can't choose their house, so they are just on the list, and then they choose for a neighborhood. But also in the social housing are a lot of people from Suriname background, and yeah, they recognize, that's what they like. They recognize their roots. That's what I had so many positive reactions. It's incredible. People are so happy with it. Maybe there are people who hate, I don't know, but the reactions to me are very positive.
And for you, Wouter, you grew up, of course, you do have this Suriname background, but you said you're a Bijlmer native, so maybe your reference is much more the modernist housing of Nasut, and see how your neighborhood changes. Maybe this kind of hurts because you're so used to this modernist housing. I'm curious to hear your take upon that.
Yeah. Well, my point, and this is obviously what I researched in the university, so I have a privilege in that sense compared to my other Bijlmer natives and friends and family. but I consider identity as a process, so I prefer identification. And if I look at architecture, especially from a demographic point of view, I look at groups of people, whatever you label them, as how they adapt a certain style if they are designing themselves. So that tells me a lot about the interactions with. That's one of the aspects that I pay attention to. So it's interesting because me also has been referenced a lot if I do my research for living housing stock and housing market and just wishes and desires. Because people are obviously starters, young people. It goes for the majority of the cities in the Netherlands, but Amsterdam is really an outrageous situation now. People are desperate for housing. And almost across the board, which kind of surprised me, people do react very positive to me also.
Why does it surprise you?
It surprises me because I think, like in many other aspects, this form of identity is quite literal, and then you require more nuance. So if 20-year-olds in one group discussion are defending the Bijlmer flats because they are iconic and they've already seen a lot of them demolished. Some of them haven't even seen the demolishing because they are, let's say, 20 years old, and most of them are in the mid-90s the demolishing started. But they consider them iconic and important for our local history. But then if I talk to them about where do they want to live, they almost unanimously want to live in single-family houses. And if I then try to portray what it would look like, these are single people that often want to start in a single-family house. So the reference of a big house is really not going through the same structure as a typical Dutch person in the broader sense of the word goes through, even if you don't go to university, whatever, it's taking those steps. So they portray themselves in a future of the Bijlmer where there's often low-rise or single-family homes, but they also want to preserve the iconic structures that they are actually living in now often. So I just try to understand how they look at architecture. And if I then play around with what I would consider a colonial style, and I ask, like, what if in this colonial style housing, the majority of people end up being, for example, white or young professionals, the expats, and they live in the blackest neighborhood in the Southeast? Then it changes. But then their perception of architecture changes as well, which is surprising to me because it shows that it's very manipulative. You haven't really delved into, as a consumer, use the term deliberately, as a consumer of housing and architecture, you haven't really delved into what are the possibilities or what is happening around you. So obviously my background is different, being educated in this field, and I've always given tours to and you see so many more nuanced places. For example, especially in this site, the schools next to it are very historical. There's a researcher now working on it, and she's going to break the story, but that's a very powerful, important story connected to that school, and it dates back to the 70s. And I just want to emphasize the paradigm of that area, of the zeitgeist of that moment. Like in the early 70s, people were figuring it out. A lot of these people that ended up in the Bijlmer were often outcasts and pioneers and believers. So some of them believed they could build something from this luscious green space, which was still a sand dune. The metro was postponed because of riots and political discussions. So a lot of things happened in the Bijlmer, and you had a lot of idealistic people moving in. You had a lot of outcast people. The whole gendered aspect, the whole LHBT, the queer community that ended up there, how they all figured out their spaces and how it didn't romanticize the coexistence of each other. That's a real story of the Bijlmer to me. So if I talk to the younger generation, they have those references and they understand, like, okay, this is indeed the story. So if Surinamese young people say, hey, I recognize that this is for me, and I will ask them, okay, what does that mean? What does this architecture mean that this is for you? Yeah, it reminds me of Quetta. Quetta is basically like the big district in Paramaribo. not district, but zone. So how often have you been there? Once, maybe twice. It's an expensive ticket. We are not the migrant group, for example, such as Moroccans that can go back and forth regularly. So okay, so you reference a different style, and when you visit Suriname, it's actually, you're on holiday. You're not working, you're a visitor there. But that's besides the point. Okay, so you consider it for you, but in this current climate, probably for the upcoming years, we have a big discussion and strategy to figure out how to make it accessible, beyond just financial, but also just in rights. So do you have voorrang? So can you get
Preference?
privilege? Do you have a privilege to enroll before other people can enroll? Because I've talked to a lot of people from outside who work in the Bijlmer that wanted to buy those houses just as an investment, which is very, very logical. In this day and age, to buy a house, knowing that in 4 or 5 years, it's a pretty good investment. So, and that goes for all housing being developed now, also in the Southeast. So how do you make that accessible to people that are starting, that might be a single person? The girl that I was referencing before, she has 3 part-time jobs and studying. Try to save up. It's difficult for me. I'm not going to tell her, but it's difficult for me to see that, to understand, like, yeah, your chances are still pretty slim. But there are political incentives or political tools to say, okay, they can enroll before others. So this is where I focus on our strategy. So it becomes less material, but more like a combination of financial, I would say political privilege, and then maybe even the perspective that needs to change both with developers, designers, and the government officials, which I'm very concerned and working on, but also within the community, which is sometimes very, very blunt. And then the perspective is that I mean, okay, do you want to settle, vestigen? Do you want to buy a house? What would you do? Would you work in a co-creative session, like the highest on the participatory ladder? Would you work in those sessions to understand that in a certain amount of square meters, you can move around? You can move around with the spaces, you can adapt. So you could start off maybe with your parents in a double duplex or a family home, and then you could start a family and you could expand, or you can change the plan from the inside. So this is what I think the identity would translate to the Bijlmer, because that's something that will translate to the particular situation that we're dealing with.
Would you care to respond, Jeroen? Maybe especially on the part of the nuanced or not nuanced? I'm curious to hear your thoughts about that.
What do you mean with?
I think Wouter mentioned in the
rant.
beginning of your talk whether or not it's nuanced or not nuanced, the Me Also project, in relating to the history of growing up in the Bijlmer from either a Suriname background, but still having your reference as the Bijlmer and identifying with the high-rises, the modernist high-rises. That's how I would summarize it. But
I think it's very difficult because you talk about maybe generalizations, which is true in general, but there are so many different people with different backgrounds and backgrounds in the Bijlmer, backgrounds in Suriname, mixed backgrounds. There are people who have their background here, but they want something else, and others. So it's a mix, which is, I think, for me, it's interesting that this mix of things, which is very complex, and I think in what we did in the project is just to add something on the big market, just for people who like it, and I'm glad these people are very different, and it was affordable. So it was the cheapest house we could build. And of course, because of the market, the prices are higher now. But we can't change the Amsterdam market. And I'm glad that we also built social housing also for big families. We made ground floor housing with big gardens, so it's all there in the project. And people themselves now must do with the project what they like. And of course, it's fine if they can change their house themselves, and they can change the inside, and they can change, and you can build a more generations house. I fully agree with this idea, but to build a project within the limits we had during the crisis, it was quite limited. Now there is a different market, so maybe you can make different opportunities. But I'm interested in mass housing, so I also did very special projects for special groups. But I like to build for the mass, so you can build for a big, a wider part of the market, and not only to do special things. So that's what we tried here to do, and it can also be in a different way. And at the same time, maybe I can describe that there were projects built by other builders there, and I think Wouter knows them also. They were just standard Dutch houses with red bricks, jaren 30 style of the 30s, which was the only thing, and they called it, I think,
Sweetie wonen.
Sweetie one. They gave it a Suriname name. So to a little bit apply to the history of the Bijlmer. So, and that for me was too cheap to do. And so we tried to add things to the house which I think are architectural features, like the veranda. And when I walk around the project, this veranda really is an interesting space, because it's a space between the house and the public space. It's 30 centimeters higher, so that's very important, gives some privacy. And I see now, you can see it, what different people are doing with this space. So they really sit together, they put their stuff there, and the other one is, I don't know what doing. So it's a little bit a mess, which I think is very livable. A veranda can be everything. So it's not only about style, but also that with this concept, you can add something to a house which otherwise you were not able to add to the house. So it's a small element, but maybe it's very important to make contact with the people from the house, with people passing by, with people living around the garden, which connects people. And that are things which interest me most, even more than the architecture, because this architecture is not a style of our office. I just wanted to do something with color, with elements which I know, because many times I visit Suriname to visit my mother-in-law. She's now 99, so I hope I can visit her again. And it's also a product of a research I did, but not a research like Wouter did, which is more related to his history, his own history, and the architecture of the Bijlmer, which I think it's interesting research, and you can also build a project with that research. So which can also be an interesting one.
Does it then maybe for me, and I only know the project by images, appear to be more, let's say, give direction towards specific styles of identity than it really is? And then if I hear you correctly, you say, I just wanted some architectural elements like the veranda, which I find interesting, not necessarily related to a specific identity or a specific style. I'm curious, because for me it appears quite, let's say, traditional Suriname elements introduced in this type of architecture. But if I hear you correctly, you say more, no, these are just elements.
What interested me in the Suriname architecture, that it's a mix of different cultures. It's based on colonial architecture, but it was implemented in Suriname, then painted white because of the climate, made not in brick but in wood. And there were some features added, like the veranda, which was in fashion in New Orleans. They imported it. The white color also has a relation with German Protestant religion. So there's a mix in it, and it was made by the Suriname people themselves, which were woodcutters, and they made it their own architecture. So it was not related with, for instance, their African roots or the Indian roots, but the craft was related with their backgrounds, the craft of wood. So there was a discussion in our group because I very like the craft of wood cutting, and I know some people in Suriname who can make this ornament. So we designed a kind of ornament, and my client he really liked it, and I said, no, I can't do this. This is too much taking their culture away from them and to use it. So I want just to offer to the people of the project if they like it or not, and they can add it to the house. But in the end, no one thought it was necessary. They liked it, but it was too expensive, and it was made by cedar woods. And so there is also, it was not just an easy project culturally, because I was walking on a line, for instance, I was in the beauty committee of Amsterdam, and they criticized the project. They said, no, it's a project which is paid by a developer. How can you do this? Is this what the people want?
What was the critique exactly? Sorry.
Now, there was an art historian in the beauty committee. She said that such a project should be done by Suriname people, not. And then, for me, that is thing which is a way of thinking I don't like. Because I like the fusion, the mix, and not to put everything in a box and this is there. So this is what we spoke before Wouter came about, for instance, Aldo van Eyck and about the Dogon. And when I was a student, I was learned that everything is architecture, and you can use all resources you can use. It's not you are only in the tradition of modernism, but you can also use classicism. You can use vernacular architecture, and so that's interested me in Suriname architecture because it's a kind of melting pot of. Maybe it's even modernist because it's white, it's green, it's light and air, and because it's also an outdoor climate, so the houses are far more open than we have. So I wanted to cross all the borders and not to just to be anxious to stay in my white modernist architecture. So I tried to play with it.
Clear. Maybe some questions from the floor here, Emily?
Yeah, short answer, yes. Now, especially because I also work for the Surinamese community is relatively tight knit, so it's quite. I know some of these project managers by name. I kind of know who can put forth certain identity aspects. The project of Sweetie Wonen, which translates directly to lekker wonen, mooi. I've said to the person behind it, like, that's a very literal wink to a demographic, but it's very difficult for in sense of affordability and the way that it connects. But let's keep it on an infrastructural level. The Karspodreef is one of the main artery roads, and that around the project of me also goes up again. In a nutshell, the transformations of the mid-90s until the 2005, so to say, shows that there's a big discrepancies that you're talking about. The Bijlmer is often by professionals, including the people local government, is very much viewed as top-down organization. So there's many examples where, for example, the road changing, going up and down now, shows the intent of creating stadsstraten or lanes and lowering it, but not foreseeing the consequences and the expenses of it. So a lot of these projects where it hasn't been able to be lowered, you see low housing replacing the honeycomb flats that really can't really connect to, let's say, the elevated roads. And then you also have the demolishing of the parking garage, which the idealistic people that voice their opinion much more, specifically the Bijlmer believers, and I call them 1.0, but the Bijlmer believers that still kind of in local history texts say, no, the problem was not the design, it was more the people. So there's a big elephant in the room of who has ownership of narratives and how do these symbols, sometimes literal elements in the context, how do you perceive that? Is it heritage? Is it part of what they now call the DNA? In all of my research, I put it in there. And then what I face is often that in those political talks, you kind of see the positioning, I just bring it down to power, but the positioning of different people saying, hey, I kind of need to be positioned in this way, so it has to fit a certain narrative. So it really becomes like a compromising transformation and part of identity. So on a personal level, I try to influence a lot of people around me that have these positions. I've seen them use this information to position themselves even further. And now I try to work on transparency. So my studies go beyond the Bijlmer. I also study Surinamese architecture throughout my life. Hogeneute, I've been there a couple of times. And then I would look at what the generation who's now building, what are they building? It's much more going towards American, which is often neo-classicism, more European in introducing styles. So I try to at least comprise repositories, really reflect on it, have a lot of talks about this, and now also include the development aspect of, let's say, mede-opdrachtgeverschap, so other forms of cooperatives and self-build, to at least have all of these results become more and more transparent for the people working in different fields. So that at least the complexity and layered DNA identity of the Bijlmer is accessible. Because the people that have been projecting the identity, and I really take this also to a local political level, I know these names, you can trace it back, you can see that it has influenced what is being built. In one of a tender that I'm now part of the design team, I just see the arbitrary aspect of how much you can influence a very early stage. So this is when I'm just mostly focusing on strategy and saying, hey, I have all of these research, pick it apart, look at it, this is how we do. You want to talk to a lot of people, I can bet the usual suspects will show up unless you organize something in an informal sense, and then you have all other types of people showing up. And now I'm in the tipping point that people start to understand, to say, hey, let's actually work towards this type of dialogue beyond organized participatory approaches, which you can still do, but just let's come together, let's meet off hours, come join our barbecue, let's organize something co-creatively, yes. Yeah, in different phases. I'll give a very quick example that I was involved with another project, which is also a very big brand of building now. You probably know the building Our Domain. It's in the southeast, designed by OZ Architects. A lot to be said about the development there as well. And if you understand the context, just as me also, it's a different context when it was developed. Now it's entering a market with a 40-40-20 rule, and some people kind of understand what it is, but in those times, it was different. So the project is being realized, and it's definitely geared towards young professionals and expats, so to say. But the political agenda is to make it accessible for the young people of the Bijlmer, which then they ask me and my partners, how can we reach them? Because even the local government acknowledges that they do not reach the young people. So we say, okay, we have 2 weeks. Let's build some platforms and really get the word out there. But what are the credentials to enter this project? And then you see it mismatch a lot of the people in the Southeast. Do you then take this type of assignment and have a payday? Or do you challenge those type of prerequisites? So we challenge that. And we also organize this dialogue. And then we get all of these reactions like, hey, why is it such a higher education standard? Why is it this expensive? So you basically almost get the backlash, which you can then at least confront with, this is the situation, this is the reality check that we need. So me and my partners, we did do that. And to be fair, we understand the context of the project of our domain, and we understand the backlash and the disappointment for a lot of young people that are desperately looking for housing. But the next step in the next development, the city council, or not council, the city board of bestuur, they did change the tone. So now they have taken our ongevraagde,
Unwanted advice?
unsolicited
advice.
feedback, and now the talk is differently on a strategic level. Let's include lower level educated people. Or let's reframe what we call target groups into personas so that we actually can make it more accessible.
And you're convinced a different type of architecture will evolve out of that, or?
I think the mind state of understanding very much to have a lifeline inside of the community, to have a continuously feedback loop that goes beyond wailing, like beyond complaining. Just really have the data and the information and networks out there to say we need constant re-evaluation of a lot of these things. Because for me, and that might sound a little bit dystopian, but the amount of information that needs to be shared the amount of knowledge needs to be so wide and in-depth that you need a lot of institutions, people, groups to have that open source, transparent mentality to say, okay, I cannot just keep concluding that people want to have single family houses for themselves based on the rent that their parents paid because the Bijlmer was once vacant. They ended up in there because it was a very problematic development beforehand. That's the history of the Bijlmer. That means that if you organize only that reference in your own lifestyle, you end up with the data that we have now that most young people live with, a lot of young people live with their parents, and it's very difficult for them to start off or to move on within the community, which is disrupting the care networks, the social networks that a lot of people depend on in the Bijlmer.
I think we're getting close to the last few minutes, I would say. I don't know if there's any more questions from the YouTube or Zoom. No? Maybe Jeroen would like to respond to some of the stuff that's been said, or some final words.
No, what Wouter says is, I think, a general problem in the Dutch housing market. It's not
necessarily the Bijlmer.
No, it reflects also on the Bijlmer. And
is it in the Bijlmer maybe more on the surface?
Maybe, I don't know. Maybe there is a larger mix of cultures which you would like to have, which is more visible in new projects, and which is not visible at all, maybe. But what I see that the market now is on houses for sale or social housing. It's a reach of 50 square meters to 70 square meters, and it's all the same. It's a social dwelling is the same as a project for the market, and it's all small, and it's all 1 or 2 bedroom apartments, and that's it. So in the 70s and 80s, and I started as an architect in the end of the 80s, the social projects were the projects for experimentations. So there, and this also, for instance, the Jo van Sticht project, but all So the housing associations were able to experiment with housing types. So you had housing for families, but also for individuals or for grandparents. Were in the family house were related, and there were all kind of types, and you can still find them in the map of the history of Amsterdam housing. And it's completely has disappeared. And the market is not developing new typologies. The higher houses for rent are all the same. So, and even the tower typology is the most dullest what we can design as architects.
So there's little space to maneuver as an architect
yeah,
nowadays,
it's
much less
quite
than
horrible
before.
at the moment, and that's not only in Amsterdam. But it's in the Netherlands. And when we got a project from a housing association, and we said, "What do the people want?" They said, "We are not interested. We are only interested for some projects, and we know they serve well the market and also the social market, and they are good to maintain, and that's it." So it's really when you compare it to the 80s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and it ended in around 95 when the social housing got a different regime. I think it's also for architects. They are now designing facades and making different patterns on facades, and that's it at the moment. But it is not inventing different types. Only maybe small villas and very small projects for a CPO. But they are really small projects. That's not for the mass. So.
I agree that it's sometimes almost unthinkable to have social housing, family homes. Like it's you don't really. But at the same time, the Bijlmer was designed for middle and upper class, standardized. Or we talk about standardization and mass production as well, mostly. And then you see how the vacancy and the migrant waves really changed the perception of those houses. Because in the end, that makes it very particular from an architectural point of view. The people that I just discussed, like the general feedback or these desires for the characteristics of a house, it's because these big houses were occupied by people that came fresh into the city or just moved around a bit. These are big houses, and it's almost unreal to really fathom what were the conditions for that to happen, like a former colony, riots in the city center, very different zeitgeist, and the mass production of housing, which was it's in the DNA of the Bijlmer, has become something that people now desire social housing, which is a very interesting thing to really reconcile, to say, okay, is that, for example, the Bijlmer flat, is it possible to break down bigger houses in an affordable manner for the amount of household types that often reference smaller and smaller and smaller units?
Maybe Jeroen as a response?
My conclusion for today is that we have to focus not maybe on the houses themselves, because this market is complete. We are not able to invent different types, but it's more now the focus should more be on the space in between the housing. I think that's because the house is getting smaller, people are more living outside maybe, and we have to focus on this space, which is in between the houses, or it can be also in a building between the apartments or in between the houses, and then make transitional spaces. I think that should be the focus of the next years, because we know all the apartments are almost the same. Okay, so let's invent new things as architects and not only looking at the facades and what is there, but just look at the spaces and what people can use together and build new communities, new communal spaces. I think that can be an interesting focus for the future.
And I think actually that's also what you were very much involved with.
Yeah, I can definitely add on that. One of my standard questions is just to, from this market viewpoint, is to ask people, target groups, personas, to ask what kind of facilities or communal spaces or collective spaces uh, would they desire or would they invest in different ways than just financially? Like, would you be part of an organization that is concerned with the maintenance of this inner courtyard or this public workspace that serves maybe 24, like Prospect 11 is an obvious example. That's a 24/7 facility. So a lot of things are multiple, multi-use, et cetera, et cetera. It's you don't often get like the golden answer just by asking, but you definitely get it, I guess, in temporary strategies. Is where you really can figure it out with the people from communities. But you have to figure out a way to optimize this transition, which I agree with, less private space in the sense that what you buy or own in the market, and then what you actually share, and maybe through comments and that kind of stuff. So that's a question I always embed in interviews, and this is also something that I focus on in the designs. Yeah.
Okay. I'm afraid we have to kind of close because I think we're running completely over time. So I'd like to thank our speakers both. Thank you very much for illustrating it and kind of discussing the different positions and ideas. Thank you so much. Thank you everybody here. I'd also like to say that we are closing off this series this Thursday at 6 p.m. back on the Zoom, I think, not live. We will have our colleague Saskia van Stijn moderating. We have Floris Alkemade, the state architect, Robert Kloosterman from the University of Amsterdam, and I keep forgetting somebody, Suzanne van Kampen. Okay, so thank you all so much.